Good?
Last weekend, Afghanistan once again came into focus as the new Secretary of State, John Kerry, paid what the media was quick to label as a clandestine visit to the country.
What was the agenda of his unannounced trip? What did the relations between Afghanistan and the US look like, with the US withdrawal deadline approaching fast? And what are the main risks facing the country? We're discussing these and other issues with our guest speakers, Mr. Waliullah Rahmani, Executive Director of Kabul Center for Strategic Studies in Afghanistan, and Dr. Ahmed Rashid, a Pakistani journalist with extensive experience in Afghanistan and the author of the book, The Taliban. So with Mr. Kerry now on his trip back to the United States, it looks like the situation in Afghanistan for the United States is becoming increasingly complicated with the huge debt the United States are fighting against, and with all the necessary budget cuts and, whatever. And with, whether we like it or not, a waning influence of the United States in that country.
No, I mean, I think even in the best of circumstances, the withdrawal of the United States forces from Afghanistan would have been sort of a complex and quite sort of risky affair. There was always the risk that people would perceive this as a cut and run. There was a risk that the job would not be done properly. Now, with the extra budget constraints that the US is facing, not only in the military sphere, but effectively across the whole government budget and all departments, then we have the extra problem that the cost-cutting that the Pentagon, that the US government is being compelled to do, has an even greater risk of cutting the resources available for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And this, in fact, increases the risks that all may not go as smoothly or as well as they would plan.
Well, nothing goes smoothly in Afghanistan now. Just to remind our listeners, before the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry traveled to Afghanistan a fortnight ago, the country was visited by Chuck Hagel, who took his first trip abroad as Defense Secretary to Afghanistan, and this is quite significant, because his visit was preceded by all kinds of unfortunate episodes, to say the least. First of all, a terrorist attack was committed close to the building of the Afghanistan Defense Ministry, which Mr. Hagel was supposed to visit. And that was followed by a fiery rhetoric of Mr. Karzai, who actually, what he did, he accused the United States of working with the Taliban, because the point in his discourse was that this explosion was in fact playing into the hands of Americans, who, according to some experts, do have a hidden agenda of remaining in Afghanistan to contain China. Now, this, of course, is vehemently denied by all officials, but nevertheless, the suspicion is there, and the flavor of that uneasiness could be felt in the discussions between the U.S. and Afghanistan officials.
I think certainly the analysis of that has a lot of sort of relevant points to it. I think the US strategy for withdrawal from Afghanistan was always going to be that once the security forces, the local security forces in Afghanistan, could be entrusted with managing that security, then there would no longer be a role for the United States.
Isn't it a little bit too idealistic a vision?
It's certainly the vision that they've been working towards, and I think the idea of the vision was really more to put a marker down to say that the withdrawal was something that was going to happen, rather than saying this is an open-ended mission, it's a long presence in Afghanistan, by saying when it is possible to hand over security, then we will do it. And this is a process they've been working towards some time. However, I think it's correct to say that when you see a lot of terrorist incidents, bombs going off within the region, this sparks off two problems. I think one, it allows questions to be raised of Mr. Karzai. People will start to question the efficiency of how the security situation is being managed. And when there are those questions, you always have people agitating for some kind of change of personnel, change of strategy, change of government. So, the deadlines we set, the criteria we set are not being met. What can we do to change that? And I think the other part of that is that not only is Mr. Karzai then becomes in a very fragile position, it does mean that arguments are saying, well, actually the security situation is not as we had hoped. Yes, we promised, of course, we would leave when the security situation was under control. But these elements, these things do certainly give a pretext for some kind of force, for some kind of, backtracking from this idea of a full withdrawal.
Well, and now I suggest it's time to turn to our guest speakers. And our first expert to talk to is Mr. Waliullah Rahmani, Executive Director of Kabul Center for Strategic Studies in Afghanistan. Now, when I was listening to Mr. Karzai, I had an impression that he sounds like a man who feels that he is more and more isolated. And in that case, just what would be the role of the international community we're talking about?
Well, I think there are a majority of Afghans who think that Afghanistan should remain in a good and strong relations with the United States and international allies. I believe that recent judgments, interpretations, whatever, or arguments of President Karzai regards to the United States faced a lot of criticisms from insider Afghan circles. So this means that there are many who really do not support President Karzai's vision and, I think, arguments and judgments about Afghanistan-United States relationship. For that reason, I think in this time, in current time, we could term him that he has made himself more isolated. But I hope that he should not go and cross those lines that make Afghanistan once again a forgotten and, of course, an isolated place, a nation like the 1990s and 80s. So that's really a big concern for us as Afghans.
And in fact, were the relations between the current government of Mr. Karzai and the United States government a matter of discussion during the visits of Mr. Kerry and Mr. Hagel?
I do think that the United States is trying to put any arrangement to convince President Karzai that their presence in Afghanistan is in the national interest of Afghanistan. They are trying to support him and his government. And of course, they are trying to support a stable democracy to grow in this country. I do believe that State Secretary John Kerry's visit to Afghanistan and the other visits are in support of this argument of the United States and the Obama administration that they have to build and have to recover a good relations with President Karzai. I do think that the United States is doing its job, but I'm not sure that President Karzai would be willing to or would have this goodwill that he should also send good positive signals. And of course, besides signals, he should try to put some efforts for the betterment of this relationship with the United States. In that regards, I think, from the Afghan side now, from the palace, from Kabul, we really do not see some good and positive signals that is coming out.
Just to remind you, we're talking to Mr. Waliullah Rahmani, Executive Director of the Kabul Center for Strategic Studies in Afghanistan.
Do you think that this kind of rhetoric, the anti-American rhetoric, could be at least partly explained by the fact that the country is coming into a pre-election campaign?
I think he is trying to put a legacy behind him, and he has assured Afghans that he wants to be a former president in 2014. And of course, this means that he wants to hold elections. I do believe that he is trying to, he is not understanding that he is he's overreaching in this legacy-making situation in 2013. And this means that, President Karzai seems to see that it is his end of mission in Afghanistan as the president, and he sees that there's a long journey Afghanistan has come through. And of course, he sees that there are many things he could do in his team and his administrations could do that they did not and they have not delivered. So for that reason, I think, an anti-American gesture and of course an anti-American sentiment that we are seeing growing in Kabul in the past weeks and months, and I expect that it will continue, means that the team in Kabul is trying to set aside the tensions from the past 10 or 12 years of ruling and governance of President Karzai in Afghanistan, and of course they're trying to forward and divert attention towards the United States withdrawal, exit strategy and all these, so that Afghans should not come to question that why, for example, this XXX has not happened in Afghanistan while there was an opportunity that they were to deliver and they had to be delivered. So I think it is more, we could, interpret it as this way.
What do you think needs to be done to perhaps secure a more stable situation after the withdrawal of the U.S. troops?
Well, I think the key to the post-withdrawal survival of Afghanistan and the stabilization of the country is that we have to bring a new leadership in this country in 2014, and President Karzai has to pave the way for a stable transfer of power in Afghanistan in 2014. That a new leadership, legitimate out of votes of the people, should come and lead the country with new agendas and, of course, take it forward.
Any idea about who is the likely leader after Mr. Karzai?
Well, it is really quite soon to talk about the new leaders, but there are names who are coming out, and of course, I do believe that we will have a potential leader to replace President Karzai in 2014, and his name will come out soon, I do believe.
Well, Mr. Rahmani, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Mr. Waliullah Rahmani, Executive Director of the Kabul Center for Strategic Studies in Afghanistan.
This is the Voice of Russia.
This is Burning Point.
We're discussing the implications of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan.
And now we are joined by our next guest speaker, Dr. Ahmed Rashid. And just to remind you, he's the author of the book The Taliban, a Pakistani journalist with huge experience in Afghanistan. If we look at the US press, we get all kinds of conflicting signals. For instance, General John Allen, who is the former commander of international forces in Afghanistan, is saying that the Afghan security forces are better prepared than they themselves believe. On the other hand, a bunch of American experts are saying that it would be extremely difficult to maintain security in Afghanistan after withdrawal, especially given the cuts in military budget in the United States, which means that there would be a cut in financial aid. So my first question would be just, how do you evaluate the current stage of withdrawal from Afghanistan? What is the situation on the ground, and how the cooperation between Afghanistan and the US is developing?
I think there's still many problems related to the Afghan army. We still have a very high desertion rate. About 20% of the soldiers are leaving their jobs. We have 90% illiteracy. We have a lot of corruption inside the army. And certainly now this threat by the U.S. Congress not to give money to Afghanistan for the army or for development after 2014. It's a very serious threat. I've met with congressmen who told me that they will not be giving any more money. All these things add up to, I think, quite a depressing situation. I think the real problem is that if the Americans think that they can hand over the war fighting to the Afghan army, that would be a huge mistake. What is needed is some kind of ceasefire with the Taliban and some kind of peace talks with the Taliban, so that the Americans are actually handing over to the Afghan army as a country that is not at war. Then perhaps the Afghan army will be sufficient to carry out security duties, guard duties, but I don't think it's in a position to fight a war.
Why would the American Senate deny Afghanistan the money? Because it is their own estimate that the insurgency and that the challenging security situation is not going to be over even by 2015.
And let me emphasize that this is the views of individual congressmen and senators. It's not the view of the U.S. government. But what they're saying is essentially that the economic crisis in the U.S. is so severe that their voters, their constituents, will not allow them to spend money on foreign countries when that same money they feel should be spent on Americans.
Well, but that is a weird situation because in that case, Americans would also be targeted by the mounting insurgency.
Well, not only that, but, the point is that NATO and the Americans together have agreed to give $4 billion a year for 5 years for the Afghan army. Now, only half of that money is American money. The rest of the money will come from the European partners of NATO. Now, clearly, the problem is that if the Americans do not give the money, the NATO partners are unlikely to give the money also. And then Afghanistan could face a real crisis. So, this is an issue which is still ahead of us, and maybe there will be some resolution to it a year ahead. But certainly, if these contradictions with President Karzai, the infighting that's going on between the Americans and Karzai goes on, then we're going to see a very negative mood in Congress.
This is Burning Point.
We're discussing the implications of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan.
And now we are joined by our next guest speaker, Dr. Ahmed Rashid. And just to remind you, he's the author of the book The Taliban, a Pakistani journalist with huge experience in Afghanistan.
Just to remind you, we're talking to the Pakistani journalist Ahmed Rashid.
But was the question taken up during the visits of Mr. Hagel and Mr. Kerry?
Well, I think there were a lot of questions taken up, but the primary was to get the relationship between Karzai and the American government back on some kind of even footing. If you recall, in the last 2-3 weeks, Karzai has been saying a lot of very controversial things, accusing the Americans of backing the Taliban, accusing the Americans of allowing the Taliban to kill Afghan civilians. And Chuck Hagel, the defense secretary, first went. He was not successful in getting a resolution to this problem. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, who has a long relationship with Karzai, which goes back to 2001, he has been more successful. But at the same time, there were other problems between the Americans and the Afghans, such as, for example, the handing over of the jail in Bagram, which holds something like 4,000 Taliban prisoners, handing over the custody of these prisoners to the Afghans. And that was finally resolved just before Kerry landed. But the real crisis is the very, very bad relations between Karzai and the Americans. And the feeling from the American side is that Karzai has become a very unreliable partner, unpredictable and unreliable.
But as far as I understand, the feeling on the part of Mr. Karzai is that he has been abandoned by his American allies.
Well, I think the real problem is that Karzai is feeling very insecure because, 2014 is very close by. He doesn't see the kind of support that he was expecting from the Americans for his own security, his family's security. And I think the other thing is the elections in 2014. Karzai clearly wants to nominate a successor, somebody who will fight the elections and win, but will also support the Karzai family. And he wants American backing for that. I think another issue between them is the whole issue of talks with the Taliban. The Taliban has said that they will not talk to Karzai. They will first talk to the Americans, and maybe at some later stage they will talk to Karzai. Karzai is extremely annoyed at this and is saying to them, basically, you have to talk to me first. I'm the Afghan government. And the Taliban are saying, no, we want to talk to the occupation forces, the Americans, before we talk to you. So there are all sorts of differences and divergences, with the Americans. Some of them are real, I think, but some of them are also made up by some of his advisors and ministers who've been giving very bad advice to him. But I think, the real risk is that this government cannot survive in its present form if we are going to see a continuation of the war. I think the first aim of the American government and NATO and the regional countries, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, India, China, should be to promote a peace process as quickly as possible so we can see the war coming to an end by the time the Americans leave.
Should that peace process involve all parties involved?
Yes, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. All the neighbors have played very important and very negative roles in that country, and all the neighbors have to guarantee that there's going to be a peace settlement. So I think everyone has to get involved. And frankly, at the moment, we're not seeing any American game plan for a regional settlement.
Mr. Rashid, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker this time was Dr. Ahmed Rashid, a journalist from Pakistan. So it looks like the Americans are considering perhaps giving up Mr. Karzai. I mean, of course, he's been in power since the year of 2001, hasn't he?
Oh yes,
more than 10 years.
Yeah, I mean he was the leader that was effectively parachuted in to Afghanistan after the US invasion of the country.
So more than 10 years in power. If the US are considering giving up the payments which they had promised to the Afghan government, nothing is going to work out.
It's a lose-lose situation for all parties. It's certainly a lost situation for the Americans because they're seen to have gone back on their man and gone back on their word to support the country, even in the absence of the military. And it's certainly a losing situation for the government on the sense that they could try to persuade, maybe there are some people who would give the government support, but seeing that it was unable to command any sort of authority, to lose the budget, to spend things, to put things into action, then equally that undermines the government in the country as well.
But it is not a losing situation for the Taliban, is it?
Well, no, certainly, exactly. This is the situation that hands very much into their hands, that they can then sort of say, the Americans did this, we couldn't trust them, the government did this,
well,
it was not effective.
Well, and just giving ourselves a benefit of doubt if the Americans are really conducting some kind of covered talks with the Taliban, Americans would not be the ones to be losing the game.
No. I mean, I think, there would certainly be, at a strategic level, I'm sure people in the United States, in the Pentagon and the security forces, as a situation, hypothetically, they would have assessed that there was a possibility of the Taliban coming to power. And I could imagine that they would then say, well, what should we do in that eventuality? It may not be an eventuality that they particularly wanted, but I'm sure there were people that have planned a certain course of what to do if that happened. And also to think, well, is there anything we can do now to make that situation better for us?
Drawing an awkward parallel, just the same position they seem to be adopting in regards of the Central African Republic.
Exactly, that it's a case of looking at the current scenario, trying to second guess in a way what is happening and how to position themselves in the best circumstances should something like this happen.
Oh, precisely. However, the fate of Afghanistan itself, in that case, well, in all cases, is hardly enviable, is it?
No, I mean, I think it's sort of caught between some very sort of strong forces on either side, and there's also, we've sort of seen from this situation, from this uncertainty, there's still the backdrop of violence within the country. There's still the very, very strong presence of the Taliban.
The wanton killings,
Mm-hmm.
Which is an awful phenomena of a guerrilla war, and the guerrilla war is there. I'm not sure it is going to go away. Which brings us to square number one, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you were talking about the situation for the country itself. I mean, I think there's something of a nightmare scenario possibility, really, that after the US withdrawal, the return of the Taliban, people would be asking the questions for the country, what was the last 12 or 13 years about? What has that invasion achieved? What has all that destruction achieved? Where has the country progressed?
And we would hate to see the outcome of that invasion, a return of the Taliban.
Yeah, exactly. This was the whole basis of why America went into the country in the first place.
No. They were hunting for Al-Qaeda, which was never there.
This was the other aspect, the Al-Qaeda side, but it became very much to move the Taliban. Very quickly became a project for the mission. So yes, if they would return to power, then very much the mission has, to a large extent, failed, and the country has not seen anything positive from those 12 or 13 years.
A disastrous analysis, but I suppose it's quite accurate.
Yeah, well, it's a worst case scenario that is certainly plausible at the current moment.
Well, and with this we end this edition of Burning